A panicked voice crackled over the 911 dispatch. "Yes, I need to report a suspicious person. He's black and he's jogging in our neighborhood. He just doesn't look like he belongs here." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Meanwhile, a man ran, his breath steady, his pace even, completely unaware that he was the subject of this frantic call. He was simply enjoying his morning exercise. But in this seemingly perfect neighborhood, a simple jog was about to become something far more sinister. Because the people who called 911 weren't just reporting a stranger, they were reporting the very person sworn to protect and serve their community. They were reporting their new police captain. This was a story of assumptions, of prejudice, and of the shocking moment a community's biases were exposed for the world to see. It was a story that would make people question their own judgments and wonder how a simple morning run could turn into such a dramatic confrontation. Meadow Creek looked like something out of a magazine. The houses were large and well-maintained, with perfectly manicured lawns and flower beds bursting with color. It was the kind of place where people waved to each other from their driveways, where kids rode their bikes without a care in the world, and where the biggest concern seemed to be keeping up with the Joneses. It was, in a word, perfect. Or at least, that's how it appeared on the surface. Beneath the veneer of tranquility, however, lay a subtle undercurrent of unease. The residents of Meadow Creek prided themselves on their close-knit community, but that closeness often came with a watchful and sometimes judgmental eye towards anyone who didn't quite fit the mold. Michael Carter was new to Meadow Creek. As the newly appointed captain of the police precinct, he believed in leading by example, which included getting to know the community he served. He was a dedicated officer with a distinguished career built on fairness and a commitment to justice. He was also a man who enjoyed the simple things in life, like a good cup of coffee and a morning run. That morning, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the quiet streets of Meadow Creek. Michael laced up his running shoes, took a deep breath of the crisp morning air, and set off at a steady pace. He enjoyed the rhythm of his feet hitting the pavement, the way the early morning light filtered through the trees. He was focused on his run, on the feeling of his body moving, on the quiet peace of the neighborhood. He had no idea that his presence, his simple act of jogging, was about to become a major point of contention. He was, after all, a black man in a predominantly white neighborhood, and in Meadow Creek, that alone was enough to raise suspicion. As Michael continued his run, he passed several houses, unaware of the eyes watching him from behind curtains and blinds. A group of neighbors, gathered on a porch for their usual morning coffee, exchanged uneasy glances. Among them was Karen Miller, a longtime Meadow Creek resident. Karen was known for her involvement in, well, everything. She was on every committee, organized every neighborhood event, and considered herself the unofficial guardian of Meadow Creek's pristine reputation. She wasn't a bad person, not inherently, but she was fiercely protective of her community, and her anxieties often led her to jump to conclusions. A recent string of petty thefts in a nearby town had put her, and many others in Meadow Creek, on high alert. "Doesn't he seem a little out of place?" Karen murmured, her gaze fixed on Michael as he jogged past. Another neighbor, sipping her coffee, nodded slowly. "I haven't seen him around before." "And that hoodie," Karen added, her voice laced with suspicion. "It's not exactly jogging attire, is it?" The group exchanged worried looks. Their fear, fueled by Karen's subtle prompting, began to escalate. Mr. Henderson, an older gentleman, known more for his prize-winning roses than causing trouble, cleared his throat. "There have been those break-ins lately, over in Oak Haven." Karen's eyes widened. "Exactly. We need to be vigilant." She reached for her phone, her hand trembling slightly. "I'm calling 911, just to be safe." Her voice was a hushed, frantic whisper as she spoke to the dispatcher. 911? Yes, I need to report a suspicious individual in Meadow Creek. He's a black man, jogging. He doesn't look like he belongs here. He's wearing a hoodie. I'm worried. I think he might be casing houses." Meanwhile, Michael, oblivious to the drama unfolding behind him, rounded a corner, his pace steady and his breathing even. He was enjoying the run, the quiet solitude of the morning. He had no idea that his presence was being interpreted as a threat, that his every move was being scrutinized, that he was being judged solely on the color of his skin. Karen, emboldened by the confirmation that the police were on their way, decided to take matters into her own hands. "Come on," she said to the other neighbors, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and self-righteousness. "Let's go talk to him." The group, now a small posse of concerned citizens, hurried down the street, intercepting Michael a few blocks later. They formed a semicircle around him, blocking his path. "Excuse me?" Karen said, her voice sharp and accusatory. "Can we help you? We haven't seen you around here before." Michael stopped running, slightly surprised by the sudden confrontation. He took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "I'm just out for a run," he replied, his tone even. "Is there a problem?" "We're just concerned," another neighbor chimed in, her eyes darting nervously between Michael and the others. "We like to keep our neighborhood safe." The implication was clear. He was a threat to their safety. Mr. Henderson stepped forward, trying and failing to soften the intensity. "We've had some break-ins lately. We are all a bit on edge." Michael felt a surge of frustration, but he kept his voice level. "I understand, but I assure you, I'm not causing any trouble." The neighbors, however, weren't convinced. They exchanged skeptical glances, their body language radiating suspicion and distrust. The idyllic morning in Meadow Creek had taken a decidedly dark turn, all because a black man dared to go for a run. The wail of sirens pierced the quiet morning air, growing louder as two police cruisers approached, their lights flashing. The neighbors, feeling a mix of relief and vindication, stepped back as the cars screeched to a halt near Michael. Two officers emerged, Officer Jones, a young, white officer with a stern expression, and Officer Davis, a black officer with a more cautious demeanor. Officer Jones, clearly taking the lead, approached Michael with a hand resting lightly on his holster. "Sir," he said, his tone clipped and professional, "we received a call about a suspicious person in the area. Can we see some ID?" Michael felt a wave of frustration wash over him. He was being treated like a criminal, simply for going for a run. "I'm not doing anything illegal," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "I'm just jogging." Karen Miller, emboldened by the arrival of the police, stepped forward. "He's being evasive," she exclaimed. "He won't tell us what he's doing here." Her voice was laced with a mixture of fear and self-righteous indignation. Officer Davis, observing the scene, sensed that something wasn't quite right. He noticed Michael's expensive running shoes, his athletic build, and the absence of any signs of criminal activity. He also noticed the anxious, almost accusatory expressions of the neighbors. "Sir," Officer Davis said to Michael, his tone more conciliatory than his partner's, "please, just cooperate. It'll make things easier." He was trying to de-escalate the situation, but the underlying tension remained. Michael looked from Officer Jones to Officer Davis, then back to the group of neighbors watching him with a mixture of fear and suspicion. He was acutely aware of the optics of the situation. A black man surrounded by white neighbors and police officers in an affluent, predominantly white neighborhood. He knew that any sudden movement, any perceived resistance could be misinterpreted, with potentially disastrous consequences. He took a deep breath, trying to control his rising anger. "I understand you're doing your job," he said, his voice tight with controlled frustration. "But this is ridiculous. I'm being profiled for running while black." Officer Jones stiffened slightly at the accusation. "Just show us your ID, sir," he repeated, his tone hardening, "and we can clear this up." He wasn't willing to concede any ground, his actions clearly influenced by the neighbor's panicked 911 call and Karen's insistent claims. Michael hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. He could show them his driver's license, prove that he lived nearby, and maybe, just maybe, defuse the situation. But a part of him rebelled against the injustice of it all, the inherent bias that had led to this humiliating confrontation. He was tired of being treated with suspicion, tired of having to justify his existence, tired of being judged by the color of his skin. With a slow, deliberate movement, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. But he wasn't reaching for his driver's license. He was reaching for something far more significant, something that would change the entire dynamic of this encounter. Instead of a driver's license, Michael pulled out a leather case. He flipped it open, revealing a gleaming gold badge and an identification card. The sunlight glinted off the metal, illuminating the words that would instantly shatter the assumptions of everyone present. "I'm Captain Michael Carter," he said, his voice calm but laced with authority. "The new precinct captain, and I live just down the street." The effect was instantaneous. The air, already thick with tension, crackled with a sudden, stunned silence. The neighbors' faces, previously flushed with a mixture of fear and self-righteousness, turned ashen. Karen Miller, the driving force behind the confrontation, stumbled back as if she'd been physically struck. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Officer Jones's jaw dropped. His eyes darted from the badge to Michael's face, then back again, struggling to process the information. He looked like a man who had just walked into a brick wall. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and shaken. Officer Davis, on the other hand, reacted with a mixture of relief and a weary, "I told you so" expression. He had suspected something was amiss, and now his suspicions were confirmed. He let out a slow, almost imperceptible sigh. "Captain, I didn't realize..." Officer Jones stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. He was desperately trying to rewind the last few minutes, to undo the damage he had just done. Michael fixed him with a steely gaze. "You didn't realize what, officer?" he asked, his voice sharp and challenging. "That a black man could live in this neighborhood, that he could be a police captain? What exactly didn't you realize?" The question hung in the air, a heavy indictment of the biases that had fueled the entire encounter. The neighbors, once so confident in their suspicions, now looked utterly humiliated. They avoided eye contact, their gazes fixed on the ground. Karen Miller, usually so vocal, was speechless, her face a mask of mortification. She tried to offer a feeble apology, but Michael cut her off with a wave of his hand. The damage was done. The truth was out, and the consequences were about to unfold. With a dismissive gesture towards the rapidly dispersing neighbors, Michael made it clear they would be dealt with later. He turned his full attention to the two officers, his expression stern and unwavering. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a moment of reckoning. "Officer Jones," he began, his voice calm but carrying the weight of his authority. "I understand you were responding to a call, but you allowed the neighbors' biases, their assumptions, to dictate your actions. You didn't treat me with the respect, the basic courtesy. You would have afforded a white jogger in this same situation, and that's a fundamental problem." Officer Jones shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the ground. He couldn't deny the truth of Michael's words. He had let the context, the neighborhood, the 911 call, and Karen Miller's frantic accusations cloud his judgment. He hadn't even considered the possibility that the suspicious individual might be a resident, let alone a fellow officer. Officer Davis, standing beside his partner, nodded slowly in agreement. "He's right, Jones," he said quietly. "We messed up. We need to do better." He had seen this kind of situation before, and he knew the damage it could do, not just to the individual involved, but to the relationship between the police and the community. Michael continued, his voice softening slightly, but his message remaining firm. "This isn't just about me. I can handle this. But what about the next black man who jogs through this neighborhood? What about the teenager walking home from school, the young woman driving to work? Will they be met with the same suspicion, the same accusations, the same lack of basic respect?" He paused, letting his words sink in. "We, as law enforcement officers, have a profound responsibility. We're supposed to protect and serve everyone, not just the people who look a certain way or live in a certain neighborhood. We have to build trust, not reinforce prejudice. And that starts with challenging our own biases, with treating every individual with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, their background, or their appearance." He looked from Officer Jones to Officer Davis, his gaze unwavering. This was a mistake, a serious mistake, but it's also an opportunity to learn, to grow, to do better. I expect both of you to reflect on this, to understand the impact of your actions, and to commit yourselves to being part of the solution, not the problem. The weight of his words and his position hung heavy in the air. The lesson had been delivered. The community meeting was held a few days later in the Meadow Creek clubhouse. The room was packed, the air thick with a mixture of anxiety, curiosity, and a palpable sense of unease. Residents who usually exchanged pleasantries now avoided eye contact, the unspoken tension hanging heavy in the air. Captain Michael Carter stood at the front of the room, his expression calm but resolute. He hadn't come to scold or to condemn, but to initiate a dialogue, a difficult but necessary conversation about what had happened and what needed to change. "What happened to me last week was unacceptable," he began, his voice resonating through the room. But it wasn't unique. It's a symptom of a larger problem. A problem that exists not just in Meadow Creek, but in communities across the country. It's a problem of implicit bias, of fear, of judging people based on appearances rather than on their character. He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was silent, every eye fixed on him. I was stopped, questioned, and treated with suspicion simply because I was a black man jogging in a predominantly white neighborhood. And while I have the privilege of wearing this uniform, of holding this position, I know that many others don't. They face this kind of prejudice, this kind of discrimination every single day. He could see the reactions in the crowd. Some were nodding in agreement, their faces etched with shame and regret. Others looked uncomfortable, defensive, unwilling to acknowledge the underlying problem. Karen Miller, sitting near the front, looked particularly distraught. She had requested a chance to speak, and Michael nodded, giving her the floor. "Captain Carter," she began, her voice trembling slightly, I want to apologize again. Publicly, I made a terrible mistake. I let my fear, my anxieties, get the better of me. I've lived in Meadow Creek for 20 years, and I want us to be safe. I never meant to cause any harm, but I see now that I did. And I'm truly sorry." Her apology was met with a mixture of murmurs and silence. Some clearly believed her remorse was genuine, while others remained skeptical. Michael acknowledged her apology with a nod. "Apologies are a start, Ms. Miller," he said, "but they're not enough. We need real change. We need to actively challenge our own biases, to get to know our neighbors, to build a community where everyone feels safe and welcome, not just those who look a certain way or fit a certain profile." A man in the back, John, raised his hand, his expression defensive. "But with all due respect, Captain," he said, "there have been crimes in the area. We're just trying to be vigilant. We're not racists." A murmur of agreement rippled through a section of the crowd. Before Michael could respond, a woman in the front row, Sarah, spoke up. "That's no excuse for what happened, John," she said, her voice firm. "We can't just assume every black person is a criminal. That's the very definition of prejudice. My family moved here 6 months ago. My husband is black, and this is not the first time he has felt unwelcome here." The room fell silent again. Sarah's words had struck a nerve, exposing the uncomfortable truth that lay beneath the surface of Meadow Creek's carefully cultivated image of inclusivity. Mr. Henderson, the older gentleman who'd been part of the initial confrontation, slowly stood up. "I was there," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I went along with it. I didn't speak up, and it was wrong, plain wrong. Captain, what can we do? How can we make this right?" Michael smiled, genuine smile that reached his eyes. Mr. Henderson's question was the opening he had been hoping for. "It starts with getting to know each other," he said, his voice filled with renewed hope. "Not just waving from across the street, but really knowing each other, understanding each other's backgrounds, each other's experiences. We need to build bridges, not walls. We need to have honest conversations, even when they're uncomfortable. We need to challenge our assumptions and learn to see each other as individuals, not as stereotypes." He continued, outlining concrete steps the community could take. Organizing neighborhood events that encourage diversity, creating a community watch program that focused on actual suspicious behavior rather than on appearances, and fostering open communication between residents and law enforcement. The meeting continued for another hour, with residents sharing their thoughts, their concerns, and their hopes for the future. It wasn't a magical transformation, but it was a start. The seeds of change had been planted, and for the first time in a long time, there was a glimmer of hope that Meadow Creek could become a truly welcoming community for everyone. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Transforming deeply ingrained attitudes and dismantling systemic biases was a long-term project, a marathon, not a sprint. But Captain Michael Carter was not one to back down from a challenge. He was committed to seeing real change in Meadow Creek, to building a community that lived up to its idyllic image, not just on the surface, but in its heart. He knew that the incident, as painful and as personal as it was, had served a purpose. It had ripped off the Band-Aid, exposing the underlying prejudices that had festered beneath the community's polite facade. It had sparked a conversation, a difficult but necessary one, about race, about assumptions, and about the responsibility of every individual to challenge their own biases. He continued his work, both within the police department and in the wider community. He implemented new training programs for officers, focusing on de-escalation techniques, implicit bias awareness, and community engagement. He made himself available to residents, listening to their concerns, answering their questions, and working to build bridges of trust. He also made it a point to be visible in Meadow Creek, not just as a police captain, but as a neighbor. He'd chat with the teenagers playing basketball in the park, offer a helping hand to an elderly woman carrying groceries. And, yes, he continued his morning runs. And slowly, gradually, things began to change. More people started to attend the community events. Conversations became more open, more honest. Neighbors who had once eyed each other with suspicion began to exchange smiles, then greetings, then actual conversations. One sunny morning, as Michael jogged through Meadow Creek, he noticed a few other runners joining him. They weren't just his usual running buddies. They were residents of Meadow Creek, a diverse group of men and women of different ages and backgrounds, all running together. It was a small gesture, but a significant one, a symbol of the progress that was being made, the slow but steady transformation of a community grappling with its past and striving towards a more inclusive future. The incident with the 911 call hadn't been forgotten, but it had become a catalyst for something positive. It was a reminder that even in the most seemingly perfect places, prejudice could exist, and that it was the responsibility of everyone to confront it, to challenge it, and to work towards a world where a black man could go for a run without fear of being reported as a suspicious individual. The fight for justice and equality was far from over. But in Meadow Creek, at least, a new chapter had begun. One filled with the promise of understanding, respect, and a genuine sense of community. Please remember to share, like, and subscribe to this channel. Also, don't forget to turn on post notifications to be among the first to watch our videos. See you in the next video.